Welcome to the TEPHINET webinar on Photographic Ethics, Module 3, the Ethics of Photographic Consent. I'm your host, Aubrey P. Graham, and my contact, should you ever need it, is aubreygraham@gmail.com. Please note that all images used in these 6 modules, unless otherwise indicated, were produced by myself. I hold the copyright to the images. Photographs cannot be reproduced, copied, shared, or otherwise repurposed without my consent. For questions on how to use any of the images shown here in other contexts, please email me at aubreygraham@gmail.com. The goals of this module on consent are to learn what informed consent means and who it protects, to learn what information needs to be conveyed to the photographic subject before taking their picture, to learn when to take photographs and when not to take them, to become familiar with good and bad examples of gaining consent, and importantly, consent shouldn't be a completely new concept. FETP workers and trainees are all probably familiar with the idea of consent in relation to the delivery of medical treatment and the Code of Medical/Global Health Ethics. While perhaps less obvious, consent forms the backbone of photographic ethics as it aims to promote clear communication and empower populations and individuals to make decisions about their own representation as well as their community's representation. The terms that are important here are particularly around informed consent. Informed consent means permission granted in the knowledge of possible consequences. So Krogstad et al., 2010, notes that consent rests on culturally determined factors such as the autonomy of the individual, power dynamics, verbal agreements, or sometimes written documents that require signatures. So breaking that down, the autonomy of the individual means the ability of the individual who you are photographing to speak for themselves, make their own decisions, and consent. In this case, we think about minors as not having full autonomy to be able to consent. They require an adult. And in certain cultural situations, that may apply to other individuals as well. Power dynamics are essential to think about in terms of consent, because the dynamic across the camera is not always equal. The person that you are photographing is, just by the nature of having a camera present, in a less powerful situation than the photographer, as well as someone coming in from an outside space that is delivering medical supplies, goods, epidemiological care, vaccinations, any of these things. The power dynamics of service provision, delivery, medical care mean that there can be a sense of coercion around photography, and one must keep in mind that the power dynamics are an ethical quandary when taking photographs, and one must use their best judgment and education and communication in order to try to make sure that all participants in the photograph are as aware of its possible uses as possible. And then in terms of thinking about how to gain consent, as Krogstad is flagging, there's both verbal agreements where one verbally consents to, in this case, an image, or where sometimes written documents must be signed. I will emphasize that not all spaces, cultures, regions, and situations require or are best to have written documentation that is signed, though often agencies require it. It's one of those situations that must be played by ear, that must be understood given the cultural context. Further, Krogstad et al. Note that the informed consent process cannot simply be transferred across national and cultural boundaries without considering the gendered, cultural, socioeconomic, and educational factors that influence perception, agency, and understanding. So keeping in mind that all of those various factors come into play when taking a photograph, those determine power dynamics as well. They influence them, perhaps not determine them. And that means that we have to be thinking through all of these various aspects when taking the photograph in understanding, is consent actually consent? So why does consent matter? Consent matters for 2 really big reasons. The first is the protection of the photographic subject. Photographic subjects ought to be seen as equal participants in the photographic process. This is all about ethics. The goal is to ensure that the subject or subjects are fully aware both of the fact that you as a photographer are taking the photographs and of how those photographs might be used so that they can responsibly evaluate their risks. We need to keep in mind that FETP images are often used in medical conferences, articles, social media, photo competitions, program publications, and TEPHINET uses them in social media, marketing, print materials, website use, and they're used for donors. This means that a photograph that may be taken and seen to be taken for personal use, if it is submitted to a photo contest, may in fact be seen on a worldwide stage with a caption and information that perhaps identifies the subject, the place, and the reason the image was taken. So making sure that everybody has full information as to how the image is going to be used is critical. And so the consent actually works to protect the subject by informing them about that use and that potential use of the photograph, as well as making sure that they understand who you are and why you're taking it. The next slide will help with that as well. The second main reason to have consent is for legal protection for the agency, for the FETP or for TEPHINET or whatever agency one might be later working for. So should one check with their agency to see what their policy is? Some organizations require signed forms. Others require a common sense type of consent that allows verbal acknowledgement of the acceptance of photography and doesn't require paperwork. So there are various ways that this can happen, but it does, as with the photo contest for TEPHINET, there is a space that has to say that the photographs were consented to and taken ethically, and that is part of legal protection both for the agency and for the photographic subject. So what do your subjects need to know? When you're asking if you can take their photograph, they need to know who you are. What's your name? You're the photographer. What agency and organization are you photographing for? Is this a personal photo, or are you photographing for your FETP? Are you photographing for another NGO or organization? That's essential information. And then what do you intend to do with the photographs? It's necessary to think about all of their possible uses. As I just said, it may be something that is taken that you think you might just put on your personal social media, but in fact you might submit to the photo contest, which means it might be seen broadly on websites and publications, etc. Always err on the side of thinking the image might be seen widely. It's also possible that no one might see the photographs, and that should be conveyed too. Providing this wide range of "I might never use this photograph" to everyone in the world might have access to see this photograph protects the subject so that they understand the ways it might be used and everything in between. And then you need to think through and ask, explain, is there benefit for the subject for being in the photograph? Is there anything they are going to get out of that image? And how might FETP benefit from the image? Will it enable them to perhaps help others in similar circumstances? Or will it be used for donation? Will it be used for the website? Or will it be used simply to show the good work that the FETP trainees are doing? Will the subject be able to see their images anywhere? Often people, when they take a photograph, want to see it later. So will a copy be returned or sent back to the subject? Or will there be a web link or a Facebook message or a social media message in which you can send the image or that they could see it? A really wonderful thing to do is always to return the photographs to the people that are in them in any way, shape, or form. So importantly as well, within consent, it's not just about getting consent, but it's about effectively communicating so that should someone not want to consent to a photograph, they feel comfortable to do so. It's essential that one lets photographic subjects know, so photographers let photographic subjects know that they can decline to have their image taken at no consequence to themselves. There should be no repercussions for an unwillingness to be photographed. Equally, if possible, it's best to provide an email, phone number, or means to contact you or the program or program manager or the like, should for any reason the subject change their mind on the consent to use their image. While this isn't always possible to accommodate, sometimes a subject may get in touch well after a photograph has been published. It is a good act to practice and to be ready to field. So should someone have the photograph taken, go home and talk to their family, and their family advise strongly that that photograph never be published, they need to be able to get in touch with you for their own protection and as a means of consent or denying consent. Importantly as well, as I mentioned earlier, not everyone can give consent. Not all subjects, especially minors and others in special circumstances, are able to consent. Minors require parents or guardians to also consent to their images. And using good judgment with an emphasis on the care of the subject is more important than getting the good photo. And that is an essential part of all of this, is slowing down to get consent and using your good judgment about what photographs to take is far more important than grabbing that decisive moment. Always do consent first, always have the right to take the photograph, and then take the photographs, even if that means you miss that one critical image. It's okay. It's much more important to be equitable to the subjects. And then what do you do when the answer is no? Can I take your picture? No. Well, you can simply accept their declination and move on. That's always a good option. And yet, if you have a moment to talk and speak with them, it might not be a bad idea to explain all of the things that last slide said to explain, and then to ask if you can feature them in a way that will not show their identity. If they still say no, you can also ask if it's okay to photograph the physical parts of life around them. Think about the landscapes and the still lives of how they're living in that space. And of course, if they say no to that, simply, that is absolutely okay. Thank you so much for your time, and move on. But as you can see with the two images pictured here, landscapes, hands, feet, sometimes various appropriate parts of the body, appropriate parts of the home, of the community, can also tell a really important story, and one doesn't need to have an identifiable subject. So as I said, you should always try to gain consent first. If you don't receive consent, you should simply say thank you after going through what we just went through, and thank people for their time and not take their photograph. But talking through a couple of negative examples, things to avoid are to avoid manipulation. Try to avoid coercion of the photograph. There's already the possibility of problematic power dynamics with simply being a photographer from a program or a training program that are going to come into play here. So avoiding forms of outright coercion for the photographs, avoiding not providing accurate information, and avoiding sneakily taking pictures is all very important. A negative example that I like to use comes from real life, from an NGO photographer who used to gain consent for portraits and would take a couple of portraits with some people and then would go away and come back with a very long lens to take pictures from far away later and snap these sneaky hidden pictures when people weren't aware that they were happening, hiding behind trees or up on top of a hill back into their homesteads. Even though consent has been attained, doing an act like that is in certain ways unethical or of questionable ethics. And it's much better to just take the time, slow down, and spend time with the population that you want to photograph to be able to get those wonderful photos around those people in that population without having to hide behind a tree to do so. A positive example might be, for instance, Zaida here in Mungunga 3 camp, who I sat down with for a good 20 minutes to talk through how this image would be used. And while this image was used for my dissertation research on humanitarian photography in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, I also mentioned that it would be used in photographic exhibitions, in presentations, in online presentations like this one. And I said also, Zaida, I might never use this photograph. There's a chance that no one ever sees it other than you. But at the end of the day, I did use the photograph, but there was a long conversation that explained exactly who I was working with, my university, what the research was I was doing, why I was taking those photographs, how she could contact me. And I came back to the camp the next week and returned her the image in print. So sometimes, that's an extreme example of a positive way to get the consent, but sometimes simply taking the 5 minutes to have the conversation about what you're doing, why you're taking the images, who's going to see them, and how they can get in touch with you. It makes a world of difference in the dignity and equity across the camera. And it diffuses, even though it doesn't completely undo, some of the problematic power dynamics that are shaped by being in a position of power simply by wielding the camera itself. So in summary, always err on the side of too much information. Always approach photographic subjects as equal participants in the photographic process. And no is always okay. If individuals or groups don't want you to take the photograph, it's worth talking about thinking about why that photograph is the one you want. And I think that's an important point that we don't do enough in photography, which is when someone refuses a photograph, really take the time to say, why did I want that photo? Why was that so important to me? Did it look like a photo I've seen before? Is it something that I want to send to the photo contest? If it's so important and they're denying it, what is the relationship between them not wanting it and me wanting it? And really working through some of that to understand if that photograph is actually important and what the need is for it. So when we don't just say no and move forward, when someone says no, really think hard about why you wanted that photograph in the first place and start to work through some of the power dynamics and the problematic aspects that may come with it, as well as the essential importance of ethics in that. Okay, on to the next module, which, as I've said many times, are these notion of power dynamics. So the fourth module that we have here is Photographic Ethics, Module 4, Ethics, Images, and Power Dynamics. So this will help unravel a bunch of that term and ways to diffuse it.